Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And as you've heard, my topic this afternoon is slavery. Slavery is, in fact, a vast topic. It's been the subject of enormous scholarship in recent years. In this talk, I want to focus on the Atlantic slave trade and Britain's involvement in it in particular. Ships were the central technology that enabled the Atlantic slave trade to flourish. Ship construction evolved greatly over the centuries that the trade continued, resulting in bigger and faster slave ships. Navy ships, too, played their part, first in protecting the trade and later carrying out anti-slavery patrols. And for everyone involved with the trade, sickness and death were constant companions. Well, slavery and slave markets were, of course, a common feature of the ancient and medieval worlds. In Africa, there were established slave routes to Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Egypt. Cairo was a major staging post for slaves in the Mediterranean world. Slaves were bought and sold by middlemen and often transported over great distances. The Greeks and the Romans recruited slaves from the lands around the Mediterranean and beyond. By the 15th century, Arabs had established slave posts on the East African coast, from where they were shipped to the Persian Gulf and India. Slavery and the slave trade were thus well established on several continents for centuries before Columbus discovered the New World in 1492. Portugal was the first European power to become involved in Atlantic slavery. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored raids to the West African coast in the 1440s, and black Africans were brought to Portugal. A trade was established involving African chieftains, mainly in Mauritania and Upper Guinea, selling captured slaves to the Portuguese, and some of these were then re-exported to Spain. The Pope gave his blessing to the trade in a bull of 1442. Enslaving Africans fell within the limits of a just war, and this was extended in an edict of 1452, which gave Portugal the right to enslave captives taken in such a war. But up to this point, the movement of slaves was from the west coast of Africa to southern Europe. Following Columbus's discovery of America, Portugal decided it needed to move quickly to protect its interests against its rival Spain. At the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, Portugal claimed the right to possessions south and east of a line 270 leagues west of the Azores, while Spain claimed the right to dominions north and west of the line. Portugal claimed Brazil in 1500, following the arrival of Pedro Cabral, and began sending settlers to Pernambuco in the northeast of the country. The treaty also gave Portugal commercial rights in Africa. They began building forts in the Gambia and along the Gold Coast to protect their interests, which included both slaves and gold. In the early 16th century, Portugal started shipping African slaves to several of its Atlantic island possessions, including the Azores, Madeira, and the Cape Verde Islands, to work on sugar and cotton production. In Brazil, settlement rapidly extended throughout the region, and the first African slaves were introduced in 1538, many being reshipped from the Atlantic islands. In the 100 years between 1551 and 1650, around 250,000 slaves arrived in Brazil, with most disembarking at either Rio de Janeiro or Salvador. The first African slaves taken to Spanish America arrived on a Portuguese vessel in 1502. The Spanish authorities were keen to expand the slave trade, and in 1521, the Emperor Charles V instigated the system of asiento, which legalized the shipment of slaves to Spanish America under a royal license. Slavery flourished in Spanish America as a result of sugar cultivation, gold mining, and the asiento. Between 1551 and 1650, the Spanish colonies received about 190,000 slaves under the asiento, and many thousands more that were smuggled. Slaves were delivered mainly to the ports of Cartagena, Veracruz in Mexico, and Buenos Aires. The origin of English involvement in the Atlantic slave trade is normally traced to the middle of the 16th century. In 1556, a London trader, William Towerson, returned to Plymouth with a number of slaves collected on his voyage to Africa. He made a second voyage the following year. Both were financed by merchants in London and Bristol. But Towerson did not transport slaves across the Atlantic, and it's John Hawkins who's usually considered the founder of the English slave trade. His first voyage to West Africa and the Caribbean began in 1561. He formed a syndicate of wealthy merchants to invest in the slave trade, and he set sail with three ships. They attacked and captured a Portuguese slave ship, and they sold the 301 slaves on board in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And Hawkins led 2 further voyages. For his second voyage, in 1564, the Queen, Elizabeth I, loaned him a large vessel, the Jesus of Lubeck, and he was dubbed Queen Elizabeth's slave trader. He set off with 3 smaller vessels and went hunting for the slave ships of other countries. He captured around 400 slaves and headed for Borbirata, a small coastal town in Venezuela, which had been founded in 1548. Hawkins' third voyage began in 1567. He obtained slaves on the African coast and added to them by capturing a Portuguese slave ship. In total, he transported around 400 slaves across the Atlantic to Veracruz. Well, until the 15th century, voyages by European mariners were limited by the construction, size, and rigging of their vessels. But from about 1450, existing designs such as the cog were superseded by a new type, the full-rigged ship. This was, in fact, the major innovation in ocean transport until the invention of iron steam-powered vessels in the mid-19th century. Before full-rigged ships, vessels were shell-built from the inside out. The planks forming the outer skin were joined together at their edges, and this shell was then made rigid by the insertion of strengthening frames. Ships were built the other way round. A skeleton, starting with a backbone or keel, was laid, posts and frames were added, and the whole was covered with a skin of planks. And this enabled bigger, stronger ships to be built. Ships that were able to carry heavy guns and sufficient men and supplies to undertake long journeys. Well, this new building technique probably originated in Spain. It was accompanied by the development of the 3-masted sailing rig. Square sails, that is, those at right angles to the mast, were carried on the bowsprit, that's the mast projecting over the front of the ship, and the fore and main masts. A triangular sail, known as a latine, was carried on the mizzen mast at the rear or stern. The first full-rig ships were a type known as carracks. Columbus's Santa Maria was of this type. It had 3 masts, each of which carried 1 large sail. The fore and main masts were square, and the sail at the back, the mizzen mast, was the triangular latine. John Hawkins made further important improvements in ship construction and rigging. He introduced the idea of sheathing the underside of his ships with the skin of nailed elm planks over the bottom timbers, sealed with a combination of pitch and hair as a protection against the worms that attack ships in tropical waters. Hawkins also introduced detachable topmasts that could be hoisted and used in good weather and stowed away in heavy seas. Masts were placed further forward, and sails were cut flatter. Hawkins' innovations made the new English ships fast and highly manoeuvrable, and in 1588 they were of course tested against the Spanish Armada, of which Hawkins was one of the main commanders, along with Frobisher and Drake, who'd 10 years earlier completed his navigation of the globe in the Golden Hind. Well, both England and France coveted the colonial wealth of Spain. English privateers, that is, armed ships sanctioned by the state to capture foreign vessels and claim their cargo as prizes, repeatedly attacked the Spanish treasures ships, transporting the gold back to Spain in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Between the 1580s and the 1630s, England began to establish colonies in the West Indies and North America. These included St. Kitts in 1624, Barbados in 1627, Nevis 1628, and Antigua in the 1630s. The colonies would provide opportunities for white settlers, large numbers of whom migrated from England. By the end of the 17th century, around 350,000 English people had crossed the Atlantic, with most settling in the new colonies. Relatively few returned home permanently. But it was the explosive growth in the demand for sugar in the middle of the 17th century that drove the need for slave labour. Sugarcane was introduced to Barbados in the mid-1640s by Dutch merchants and planters who'd been expelled from Brazil by the Portuguese. The island was claimed by England in 1624 and became a crown colony in 1663. By 1680, the sugar crop had transformed the island into what was described as the richest colony in English America. Sugar cultivation spread rapidly to other Caribbean islands, reaching Jamaica in the early 18th century. Well, cultivating sugar was extremely labour-intensive. Other labour options had been tried before African slaves became the preferred option. In South America, the Portuguese had used local Indian labour for sugar cultivation. But the settlers found this source of labour insufficient, and it was also opposed by the local Jesuit priests. England tried indentured labour in the West Indies, but at the end of the period of indenture, labourers, of course, expected not only their freedom, but also land of their own. Throughout the Americas and the Caribbean, plantation owners found it impossible to recruit sufficient numbers of either the local population or white immigrants who were willing to do the work. The only other option was slavery, and there were plenty of people only too willing to meet the demand. But sugar was not the only commodity that thrived in the Americas and Caribbean. By 1620, Virginia had begun to produce tobacco, and this became the major export of both this colony and its neighbour, Maryland, over the next 150 years. These two states were together known as the Chesapeake. Other commodities were sourced in South America. There was a gold boom in Brazil between 1680 and 1750, followed much later by a coffee boom. Cocoa, cotton and rice, amongst other crops, became significant exports from the West Indies between 1660 and 1850, 200 years. Cotton became the major export of the southern United States from around 1790. Well, the period following the restoration of the monarchy and the return of Charles II in 1660 saw a marked shift in Britain's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. In the same year, Charles granted a charter to a group of English merchants to be known as the Company of the Royal Adventurers to Africa. Charles himself was a shareholder. The object was to supply the English sugar colonies with 3,000 slaves a year at an average price of £17, or the value of 1 ton of sugar per slave. More than half of the original 32 royal adventurers granted the charter were peers or members of the royal family. But by 1667, there were also 49 untitled shareholders, most of whom were established merchants in the City of London, and they included 15 Lord Mayors of London and a number of MPs. Well, 12 years later, in 1672, the company reformed and changed its name to the Royal African Company. Under its charter, the new company held a monopoly in English trade to Africa, which it retained until 1698. During its most active period, between 1680 and 1688, departures from England to Africa totalled 249, or around 40 a year. It also sold slaves to individual slave ships and to other companies, such as the South Sea Company. And in addition to its ships, the company built around 20 establishments in West Africa, which were called forts or factories. The forts were designed to be permanent settlements and were usually built of stone. Typically, they housed a group of company employees and a small garrison, although most were not actually permanently manned. Only two, those at Accra and Cape Coast, were continuously occupied between 1672 and 1713. Factories, on the other hand, were usually unfortified and were staffed by only a handful of men. In 1698, the monopoly of the Royal African Company was removed and the trade was opened up. And after its peak, the company declined rapidly. In 1729, delivered only 563 slaves to the colonies. Private operators entered the trade, and shipments of slaves in English vessels rose dramatically. In fact, the number of slaves shipped averaged more than 20,000 a year through most of the 18th century, reaching 30 to 45,000 a year during the last decade. Overall, almost 11,000 ships were fitted out in England for the slave trade between 1698 and 1807. Slaves were also transferred between one destination and another, particularly from the smaller Caribbean islands to others and the Americas. Well, by the late 17th century, the triangular nature of the trade was well established. Ships left England for Africa laden with goods that were traded for slaves. The slaves were transported to America or the Caribbean, and the ships returned to England laden with the sugar, cotton, tobacco, and other commodities grown on the plantations. Until the early 17th century, Amsterdam was in fact the hub of the Atlantic system. But by the mid-17th century, London was starting to occupy this role. It developed an integrated financial, insurance, trading, and shipping system, along with the necessary infrastructure of docks and shipyards, attuned to the needs of the trade in Africa, America, and the West Indies. Well, London's preeminence in the slave trade was soon challenged. By about 1700, Bristol was joining in the slave trade, its merchants keen to grab a share of the enormous wealth being generated by the Atlantic trade. The shift from London to Bristol was rapid. In 1725, 87 slave ships cleared London, as opposed to 63 from Bristol. By 1728-9, half the British tonnage heading for Africa came from Bristol, which became Britain's biggest slave trader during the 1730s and 1740s. But by the late 1720s, Liverpool also became involved. Between 1726 and 1730, only 8 ships left Liverpool for Africa. But from 1731 to 1745, the number rose rapidly. And between 1750 and 1775, over a quarter of all Liverpool shipping was involved in slavery. By the mid-1740s, Liverpool had overtaken Bristol. The annual average clearances for slave ships during the 1730s were 39 for Bristol, 25 for London, 21 for Liverpool. The average number of slave ships leaving Liverpool each year was 95 between 1772 and 75, 88 over the next few years, and 107 between 1793 and 1804. And it remained dominant until abolition of the slave trade in 1807. In that year, the last year of the legal slave trade for Britain, Liverpool dispatched 101 slave ships to a week. At least 176 Liverpool merchants are known to have been involved in the slave trade, mainly in the Chesapeake area. Well, historians have long investigated the reasons why first Bristol overtook London and then Liverpool overtook Bristol. Bristol was already an established provincial port by the early 18th century. It was favoured with a westward outlook, so it was well placed geographically to trade with Africa and the Atlantic world. But of much greater importance was the enterprise shown by Bristol merchants in exploiting opportunities for selling slaves in colonies such as Virginia and St. Kitts. They also concentrated successfully on supplying slaves to England's largest sugar island, Jamaica. Bristol lost ground to Liverpool during the war years of the 1740s. It was the time of the War of Jenkins' Ear and the War of the Austrian Succession. Bristol merchants cut back on slave voyages during the conflict. In fact, they converted many of their ships into privateers. But Bristol's location was also a problem in wartime. French corsairs and Spanish warships could pick off its vessels sailing to Africa in the mouth of the English Channel. Liverpool merchants did not switch to privateering to the same extent. They also had the advantage of a more northerly port from which ships could sail around the north of Ireland and into the Atlantic, safe from sea lanes patrolled by foreign warships. Liverpool merchants were also more flexible than those in Bristol, who were largely split into distinct groups of tobacco, sugar, or slave merchants, with very limited movement between the different groups. Liverpool merchants, on the other hand, moved freely between these different commodities. And Liverpool also had a far greater commitment to building slave ships, giving it its local merchants rapid access to new vessels. In fact, a number of smaller English ports were also involved in the transatlantic slave trade, including Whitehaven and Lancaster. Whitehaven flourished briefly in the middle of the 18th century, while Lancaster had a brief period of activity in the 2 decades before the American War of Independence in 1775. But both lacked the network of commercial contacts needed for success in the trade, and coupled with a not-so-ready access to the manufactured goods needed for export. Glasgow had very little direct involvement in the British slave trade, although there were some Scottish merchants who participated in the trade through London. Well, during the course of the 17th and 18th century, the size of vessels taking part in the long-distance trade gradually increased, although quite a number of small vessels are also known to have been involved in the trade. In Liverpool, it's been estimated that the average size of a bulk vessel in 1709 was around 70 tons. As Liverpool came to prominence in the mid-18th century, the size of the vessels increased to around 100 tons in 1765, doubling to around 200 tons by the turn of the century, although there were even bigger ones. And the situation varied from port to port. By the end of the 18th century, a clear distinction was being made between a West Indiaman, trading directly with the West Indies, and usually London-built, and a Guineaman, engaged in the slave trade, and usually Liverpool-owned and built. Well, the design of slave ships was something of a challenge. The hull shape had to facilitate good speed during the middle passage. The ship had to have some defence against attack, and at the same time be capable of carrying a large return cargo from the West Indies. This is an illustration of a Liverpool slave ship in around 1780. There is a half model of the slave ship Alexander in the Science Museum, which has fine lines with a sharp bow, raised floors amidship, and a long, smooth run to the back of the ship. She's pierced with 18 guns and has large hatches, which suggests that she may have been a Guineaman. Internally, the ships usually had a flexible layout because of the different cargoes on the 3 stages of the voyage. In the first stage, they had to pack in as many trading goods as they could, usually consisting of weapons, metal goods, and textiles. But off the African coast, they had to be reconfigured to maximize the number of slaves that could be taken on board. Well, the way the slaves were loaded was graphically illustrated in the famous plan of the Liverpool slave ship Brooks of 1781, which was drawn for Parliament's attention in 1786. The Brooks was about 100 feet long, 27 feet wide, and was about 320 tons. The height between the decks where the slaves were kept was 5 foot 8 inches. The plan shows a platform in the 'tween deck, which projected 6 feet out from the sides of the ship. The diagram shows where 451 slaves could be stowed. In fact, under a new law in 1788, she was permitted to carry 454, 3 more. So this is after the change in the law. According to a surgeon who'd worked on her, she'd previously carried around 600 slaves on one voyage and 609 on another. And the Brooks was by no means the largest slave ship which operated out of Liverpool. A ship of 566 tons, called the Par, was launched at Liverpool on the 18th of November 1797. The press notice at the time declared that she was looked upon by judges to be a very beautiful vessel and the largest out of this port in the African trade for which she is designed. Well, further improvements to ship design were made in the mid-18th century, the most significant of which was the introduction of copper sheathing. In 1761, the frigate HMS Alarm, part of the West Indies fleet, had her entire bottom coppered in response to the terrible condition in which she returned from service. But it was soon discovered that the copper bolts used to hold the plates to the hull reacted with the iron bolts used in the construction of the ship, rendering many bolts useless. The Navy solved the problem by replacing the iron bolts with copper ones. The method was very effective, and it was quickly adopted by virtually all merchant ships sailing to the tropics, including the slave ships. Well, throughout the period of the Atlantic slave trade, virtually all the slaves originated from western areas of Africa. British ships took their slaves from 7 main areas: Senegambia, now Senegal and the Gambia; Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, now Ghana; the Bight of Benin, where Nigeria is; Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa. In all, this area covers between 3,000 and 4,000 miles of coast, from the Senegal River in the north to Benguela in Angola in the south. North of Senegal, the terrain was either Sahara Desert or controlled by Moroccans. Slaves were available further south of Angola, but this was impractical given the distance from Britain and the costs of getting there. Sickness was an ever-present feature of the slave trade, and not just amongst the slaves. It was one of the reasons why attempts to co-opt Indian labour into agricultural production in North America failed, along with cultural differences and conflicts over land and resources. Epidemics occurred from time to time, in which large numbers of Native Americans died as a result of tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, plague, measles, scarlet fever, smallpox, and malaria. Many of these resulted from contact with people from a different disease environment. Many of the English settlers had experienced these diseases as children before crossing the Atlantic, and they had at least some immunity to at least some of them. But the native communities were quickly decimated by contact with carriers of these diseases. And the same was true for the native Caribs in the West Indies. There were, of course, strong incentives for getting slaves to market as quickly as possible, and for keeping the sea journey as short as possible, and for having as many survive as possible. But this was not easy in tropical regions where lethal diseases were endemic. Mortality and sickness rates varied considerably depending on the circumstances, and particularly on the stage in the slave journey. Slaves were often captured far inland, and long distances were covered on foot, often taking months to reach the coast of Africa. Starvation and injury were hazards on top of disease and attack. And it's thought that mortality and sickness rates were in fact at least as high during this first stage of the journey as they were later on. We know much more, in fact, about mortality and sickness once the slaves reached the coast, although the records kept about the export of slaves are sketchier than they are relating to the import of slaves into the Americas and Caribbean. The fate of the slaves varied considerably. Some were kept in enclosures on land, called barracoons, like this one. Others were held in forts or compounds, and still others were kept on board ships of one sort or another. The pattern of mortality depended on how long ships were held captive on the African coast awaiting shipment. The longer they were kept in compounds, the greater the chance of disease breaking out. Well, death during the Middle Passage occurred largely through diseases caught in Africa. The prime cause of death was gastrointestinal complaints caused by dirty, unhygienic conditions. Flux, dysentery, and severe diarrhea were the chief symptoms of this. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, who'd been a surgeon on English ships, slave vessels, noted that some ships' holds were so covered with blood and mucus in consequence of the flux that it resembled a slaughterhouse. But there were also deaths from dropsy, scarlet and yellow fever, malignant fever, tuberculosis, and a host of other diseases. The incidence of disease followed the normal pattern of epidemics. Deaths reached a peak during the first third of the Middle Passage, before falling and levelling off later in the voyage. However, dehydration and starvation then sometimes occurred as supplies of food and water ran out. In the late 18th century, causes of death were recorded in a number of broad categories. Fevers, including general fever, malignant fever, nervous fever, and yellow fever. Respiratory illnesses included inflammation of the lungs, consumption, and decline. Not quite sure what that was. Gastrointestinal diseases, including flux, dysentery, diarrhea, and worms. And in addition, a number of deaths were recorded as accidents, mainly drowning, and also suicide, with a few people jumping overboard. Well, figures about slavery and mortality collected at the time were used for a variety of reasons. In his 1789 speech opening the parliamentary debate on the slave trade, William Wilberforce estimated that about 12.5% of the slaves transported died in the Middle Passage. 4.5% died on Western Atlantic shores before sale, and 1/3 died in the process of acclimatization to the Americas. A total mortality of about 50%, of which the Middle Passage accounted for about 1/4. And it's estimated that of the roughly 12 million slaves who were dispatched across the Atlantic, about 1.5 million of them did not survive. Well, just as the point of embarkation could be anywhere within a few thousand miles, so could the point of disembarkation. The majority of slaves transported on British ships were delivered to the Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados and Trinidad to work on the sugar plantations. Disability and disease were common amongst adult slaves in the Caribbean. Elephantiasis, transmitted by mosquitoes and resulting in swollen legs, was common in the sugar colonies. Many slaves suffered from dysentery, dropsy, fevers, and digestive and nervous diseases. Yaws, a non-venereal form of syphilis, was common, and there were regular epidemics, such as the one of cholera in Grenada in 1830. It's been estimated that as many as a third of newly arrived slaves died within the first 3 to 4 years of landfall. In 1788, Edward Long noted the prevalence of epidemic and destructive distempers in Jamaica, amongst which he singled out smallpox, yaws, and dysentery. Smallpox was a particular concern of plantation owners, and advertisements like this one often made reference to slaves being clear of the disease. In fact, smallpox was the one disease brought under some degree of control in the early 19th century. Vaccination and quarantine arrangements were used to contain outbreaks of the disease. Jamaica introduced a vaccination program for its slaves in 1813, followed by Trinidad in 1819. But of course, the range of disease to which the slaves were subject meant that survival was something of a lottery. Well, dealing with these diseases was something of an overwhelming challenge. There was little understanding of infectious diseases. European doctors still largely believed in theories of miasma, which held that diseases were the product of environmental factors such as contaminated water or foul air. But in the 18th century, large numbers of surgeons were employed on ships, some 500 people a year, qualified as naval surgeons, and quite a number of them were employed on slave ships. Naval surgeons had to anticipate the medical needs of both slaves and crew. A typical slave ship of between 100 and 200 tons would have a crew of between 30 and 40 men, and each surgeon normally had his own medicine chest like this. Slave ships without a surgeon also usually carried a medicine chest. Records survive of the contents of a number of these, of ships without a surgeon trading off the African coast. The contents of this particular chest were deemed to be sufficient for a crew of about 20 for 1 year. The internal preparations included large amounts of Peruvian bark, or cinchona, for malaria fever, and other powders, including rhubarb. The chest also contained opium and laudanum. There were large quantities of Epsom salts, gentian root, and cream of tartar in the chest. The liquids included antimonial wine and castor oil. Large numbers of pills were also carried, including bilious and purging pills. The internal medicines were lettered for easy recognition. A range of preparations were also carried for external use. This included beeswax, simple ointments, extract of lead, red precipitate, and 10 pounds of flowers of sulphur. For the treatment of blisters, there were plasters, and these could be made more effective by sprinkling Spanish flies over the surface, pressing them well in with the finger. External medicines were numbered also for easy recognition, and the chests came with full instructions on how to treat what. A number of the items here clearly had an effect, like the Peruvian bark for malaria and the opium for pain relief. But of course, against the overwhelming onslaught of lethal tropical diseases, the impact would have been marginal. Well, late in the 18th century, certain groups of people on both sides of the Atlantic began expressing concern about the morality and justice of slavery and the sheer scale of the trade. The movement was led by Quakers, especially American Quakers in Philadelphia. In Britain, the campaign took off in 1786 when Thomas Clarkson wrote an essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species. The essay came to the attention of the new Yorkshire MP, William Wilberforce, who was asked by Pitt to lead the campaign against slavery. The first meeting of the anti-slavery movement was held in 1787. Clarkson himself travelled the country addressing meetings of the movement. The campaign made full use of graphic images, most notably the one we've already seen, showing a cross-section of the slave ship Brooks, but there were many others. Slave stowage plans continued to be published for many years afterwards, including this one of the slave ship Vigilante in 1823. In the 1790s, a consumer boycott was mounted, with the Anti-Saccharine Society drawing attention to the miserable existence of slaves exploited on the sugar plantations. Further public support was raised using images of a slave with the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Further incidents assisted the campaign, such as the infamous Zong case of 1783. The Zong was a Liverpool slaving vessel that had left West Africa heading to Jamaica with 470 slaves on board in early September 1781. Outbreaks of disease amongst the captives spiralled out of control, and the captain decided to have 131 Africans thrown overboard. In 1783, the owners of the Zong applied to their underwriters to claim maritime insurance for the loss of their cargo. The underwriters declined the claim, and the case went to court. The owners lost the case, but the scandal received widespread publicity, and the Quakers petitioned Parliament on the slave trade immediately afterwards. A number of initiatives were then taken to improve the lot of the slave. Amongst them was Dolben's Act, named after Sir William Dolben, the elderly MP for Oxford, who'd sponsored the legislation. Dolben's Act of 1788 restricted the number of slaves that could be carried on British ships according to tonnage. The limit was 5 slaves for every 3 tons, up to 200 tons, and 1 slave for every additional ton thereafter. So a ship of 210 tons could carry 350 slaves, and one like the Par of 566 tons could carry over 700 slaves. The Act also stipulated that a surgeon should be present on all slaving voyages, and they were required to keep a log of all illnesses and deaths. So we have good records from that time. The Act abolishing the slave trade was passed in 1807. The last 4 legal British slave ships to leave Africa sailed from the Sierra Leone River in October 1807. They carried some 1,100 Negroes in their hulls, and they were escorted by a Royal Naval frigate in case enemy vessels attacked on sea routes made unsafe by war. The Napoleonic Wars were still to rumble on, of course, until 1815. This was the last time that British warships protected slavers. From January 1808, their job would be to hunt them down. And on the 15th of January 1808, HMS Derwent left Freetown on the first Royal Naval cruise under the new arrangements. She headed north into the slaving waters of the River Pongus in Senegal. She checked all strange sails, exchanged signals, boarded when ships stopped, and chased when they did not. Some weeks later, off Cape Verde, they stopped and detained 2 American schooners which were breaking their own country's law by carrying 167 slaves. All 3 ships headed to Freetown, where these slaves, or recaptives as they were known, became the first beneficiaries of the new British legislation. Many other actions followed. On the 1st of February 1829, the Black Joke captured the Spanish slaver Almirante, which was bound for Havana with 466 slaves on board. There was a ferocious fight, and the Black Joke went on to capture a Brazilian slaver, Carolina, and between them, the two actions released a total of 875 slaves. Well, slaves in the Americas and the Caribbean developed a range of strategies to oppose their oppression. All slaveholding societies experienced organized violent rebellions at some time or another. The most successful was in the French colony of what is now Haiti in 1791. But in 1795, a British fleet attempted to seize control of Haiti, but it suffered a heavy defeat with 40,000 troops killed. And Haiti became a republic in 1804. Other rebellions, including one in Barbados in 1816, a revolt in South Carolina in 1822, and one in Virginia in 1831. But an uprising in northern Jamaica in 1831-32 was one of the most destructive in the British Caribbean. The rebel leader, Samuel Sharp, was a deacon in the Baptist Church, and it became known as the Baptist War. It began on the 27th of December 1831, when the rebel slaves started destroying plantations. And this painting shows the destruction of the Boyne estates in the first few days of the uprising. In the 1830s, Britain had a West Indies fleet to protect British interests in the Caribbean. In practical terms, this meant supporting the plantation owners and assisting them in putting down the resurrections. In this illustration, boats from HMS Blanche are attacking and capturing rebel positions near Montego Bay. HMS Blanche was a 46-gun, fifth-rated ship, originally launched in 1819. The riot involved some 20,000 people and caused damage of over £1 million. With the Navy's help, it was eventually put down. Some 200 slaves were killed in the action. 312, including Sharp, were executed after the trials, and more than 300 others were imprisoned or transported. Well, in 1819, Sir George Collier was appointed the Commodore of the new naval force, the British West African Squadron, to patrol the trafficking routes and arrest ships involved in the trade. More determined effort this time. It was a difficult role. Not only was he to suppress the illegal British slave trade, which was already diminishing fast, but he was also expected to enforce Britain's anti-slave trade treaties with other countries. And Collier was provided with a flagship, HMS Tartar, and 6 other warships. This picture shows the slaver Formidable being captured by HMS Buzzard, an action that took place in 1834. In the 50 years between 1820 and 1870, the squadron stopped over 1,500 slave ships, and around 150,000 slaves were returned to Africa, mainly to Sierra Leone. But despite these successes, the British government estimated that only 5% of the 150,000 slaves taken each year from the coast of Africa were actually rescued. Although the Emancipation Act was passed in 1833, it only came into force 12 months later, on the 31st of July, 1834. But slaves did not immediately gain their freedom. An apprenticeship scheme was introduced, which meant they received minimal wages for another 6 years. They were, in fact, eventually freed in the British Caribbean after 4 years in 1838. And after that, the only American territories where slavery had ended permanently were Chile, Mexico, and Bolivia. Chile abolished slavery in 1823, Mexico in 1829, and Bolivia in 1831. And Rio, shown here, remained the hub for the South American slave trade. Well, after emancipation in the British colonies, it took another 50 years or so to see the end of the Atlantic slave trade altogether. America finally gave all its slaves their freedom after the end of the American Civil War in 1865. The other powers with slaves in the Americas and Caribbean gradually freed them. Slaves were freed in the Danish and French colonies in 1848 and 1849, and the Dutch abolished slavery in their colonies in 1863. But in Africa, slaves were continuing to be captured in the second half of the 19th century. Latin American countries were the last to hold out for slavery, but it was eventually abolished in Puerto Rico in 1873, in Cuba in 1886, and finally in Brazil in 1888. So the formal Atlantic slave trade may have ended, but of course slavery, like piracy, continues to this day. So I should perhaps end with a brief acknowledgement of some of the sources I've used in this, some of the key academics who've done a fantastic job in making this kind of information available to a wider audience. Thank you.